Before I introduce I'd like to remind you that on May 3rd, Dennis Sigmund, who is a professor of sciences, will talk about the deep ocean response to global warming, seeking insight from ice ages. And now, today's lecture. John Haldon is Shelby, Cullom, Davis, Professor of European History, Professor of Byzantine History and Hellenic Studies, and Director of the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iron and Persian Studies. That's the longest title of anybody at Fiscal University, I think. John is from Northumberland. He has worked in Athens and Munich, the Bachmann Institute in Frankfurt, Birmingham, and Princeton since 2005. He's a very prolific man. He has published dozens of books. The last two titles I shall give to you, the first one in 2014 is a critical commentary on the Tactica of Leo VI. And because of previous about that, I went to Wikipedia. Thanks to my high school French, I can give you all about it. It's a treatise written on behalf of, technically, a treatise written on behalf of Emperor Leo VI the Wise. The actual Greek title is Ton N Polemois Tacticon Symptomos Paradosis. Anyway, so it has to do with warfare in Byzantine times. And his latest book is The Empire That Could Not Die, The Paradox of Eastern Roman Survival, 640-740, published by Harvard Press in March 2016. Sounds like a decent book to me. Now, what Greek interested us in geosciences and Haldon is his interest in climate change and history. He's a director of projects, and one of them is called Comparative Approach to Climate, Environment, and Society in Eurasia 300 to 1900 towards understanding the impact of climate on complex society. And I think that's roughly the subject of this seminar.
Thank you very much, François. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. So, what I would like to do today is talk about a little aspect, a little part of the bigger project that François just mentioned, which is an international project involving myself and a number of other colleagues here, as well as colleagues in Europe and in Turkey. And what we're looking at is the relationship between the social structure and the social responses to environmental stressors and climate change on the one hand, and the issue of social resilience on the other. In other words, how the society responded in one way. And this is a popular misconception that I'm sure you're all aware of, that certainly in the ancient world, cataclysmic climatic events led to the collapse of civilizations. And what we set out to do was to use the historical documentation which was combined with proxy climate data and archaeology to see whether those sorts of hypotheses actually work. The short answer is, again, as I'm sure you all know, they don't, because they're far too simplistic. There are no monocausal relationships in the historical past that really explain anything very satisfactorily. So what I want to do today is to look at a little bit of work that I've been doing on my own behalf as well as part of the project, the ways in which the Eastern Roman Empire, which is the sort of medieval successor to the Roman Empire after the 5th and 6th centuries CE, responded to a number of stresses. Not just the stress of the Arab-Islamic invasions, which deprived the empire of much of its territory, but also the stress of a rapidly changing climatic context. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So I want to talk about 3 or 4 different angles. There are general issues which we need to face as historians and archaeologists when we're dealing with climate and climate science. Issues of scale, of course, issues of the relationship between the sort of data that we have, historical data, documentary, archival data, archaeological data for settlement patterns, food consumption patterns, trade and commerce and so forth on the one hand, with the proxy data that climate science and environmental historians can generate. How do we put these two together in a meaningful way to help us understand past social change? We also have questions that I've already alluded to, questions of societal resilience. How can we observe those in our past data record, and how do we interpret the information, and do we get it right? And then what sorts of examples can we best deploy to demonstrate the points? And the Byzantine or East Roman Empire in this early period of its history, from the 6th to the 8th and 9th centuries, struck me as a good example, a good case study. The reason I mentioned Goldilocks is most of you are familiar with the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and you also know that natural scientists in particular, and mathematicians and economists in the last 15 or so years have been using the idea of a Goldilocks paradigm to explain certain phenomena and to define the conditions under which something will actually survive and prosper. So I was interested in trying to find out what was the Goldilocks conditions for the survival of the East Roman Empire. What are the conditions that made it possible to exist through the crises that it experienced? And it's fine to simply juxtapose a historical dimension and an environmental dimension and say, look, there are some patterns which correspond. What I'm more interested in, and it's easy to do that, what I'm more interested in is to find out what are the mechanisms, the actual societal mechanisms which underlie those correspondences, and how can we track them down. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the historical background. First of all, you probably have some idea of what the Roman Empire, the classical Roman Empire looked like. It included all the areas which are within this borderline here, and of course Spain, France, much of Britain, excluding Ireland. It broke down in the course of the later 4th into the later 5th centuries. It was replaced by a series of so-called successor kingdoms in France and Spain and in England. But the eastern part of the empire survived intact. That's the non-shaded part. And in the 6th century, the Eastern Romans were able to recover substantial parts of the lost provinces in the west, notably Italy and parts of North Africa and southeast Spain. However, in the middle of the 7th century, we had a number of issues which began to impact on the empire from outside. The movement of migratory peoples down from the South Russian Ukrainian steppe into the Balkan region, both Turkic nomad peoples and Slav-speaking peoples on the one hand, and much more importantly, on the other hand, the breakout, if you like, of early Islam from the Arabian Peninsula down here, and the massively effective and very rapid conquests which were accomplished in the first 10 or 15 years. And one of the results of these conquests was that the Eastern Roman Empire lost its most wealthy provinces. And most of these conquests, if you look at the territorial extent of the conquest, this all happened within the first 25 years of the year 630. So you can see how dramatic those conquests were. Now, you might ask, I'll just go forward a moment, this is what's left of the Eastern Roman Empire in the year 700 or thereabouts. You might ask how an empire which has been so dramatically affected in such a short space of time can recover. Particularly when, if you look at this map, I've given you a rough calculation there of the approximate fiscal revenues to the central government of Constantinople and Istanbul that we can calculate from a range of different types of documentary source that flowed into the treasury. These, and if you look at the extent of the losses, you can see that just between Greater Syria and Egypt, the empire lost in 10 years more than 50% of its total fiscal revenues. And if you top them up, it actually comes to a great deal more. What it's left with are these relatively poor areas in Thrace and Anatolia, modern Turkey, and parts of southern Italy. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask was, how could the empire survive this sort of human-caused catastrophe? more importantly, I wanted to see how it could bounce back, because this is a picture of the year 1000, when the empire has managed to recover substantial chunks of North Syria. It's reconquered the whole of the Balkans and parts of Italy, and it counts as one of the wealthiest and most powerful organized states in Western Eurasia. So how is it possible both to survive the catastrophe of the 7th century and to gradually recover? And this is just a nice quote which I like from an early Islamic source, which gives you the Muslim perception, or one Muslim perception, of the failure of Islam to roll over the Roman Empire. And I should mention that in the 660s and in early 700s, there were two major sieges of Constantinople, which were attempts to knock out the empire, decapitate it, and conquer it, and those attempts failed. And right up until then, the Ottoman conquest in the 15th century, the Eastern Roman Empire survives, admittedly with cycles of expansion and contraction until 1453. So I had 5 questions which I wanted to ask. I'm not going to deal very much with the first 4. I'll allude to them occasionally as we go. But I want to talk today about the 5th one, and I'm going to attempt, as a non-scientist, to integrate some of the scientific data that we have from my colleagues on the border project and from other climate scientists with the historic and archaeological information. So, bearing in mind that what I'm trying to do is to make connections between societal responses and environment, we can begin to look at some of the issues that concern me. I'm going to focus on Asia Minor because that's the major, the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire for the period we're dealing with. There are small territories in the Balkans and in southern Italy and Sicily, which you will have seen on the map, but I'm going to focus on Asia Minor. And in particular, I'm going to bring to your attention the fact that the empire had certain geographical or strategic geographical advantages, one of which was that as a result of the loss of the eastern territories, a new frontier or frontier zone was established along the Taurus and Anti-Taurus mountains in south central and southeastern Turkey. And these mountains are very difficult of access from the southern side, and the Eastern Romans built up a series of fortresses and watchtowers and control points to manage the passes. It didn't stop Arab invasions and attacks and conquest of towns, but it created a perimeter, as it were, beyond which the Arabs never really penetrated and were able to settle. And so the territory to the north of that line, those red arrows, remained without a break in Eastern Roman hands. And just to give you an idea of the terrain, these are the Cilician gates, which, I'll just go back a second, which are here. You can see one just here. And you can see the nature of the terrain there, the sort of difficulties you have in trying to force your way through. This particular pass is several miles long, and it was dominated by fortresses which both sides built. And there's a regular exchange of fortresses as they fight over control. Unfortunately, the picture at the bottom no longer looks quite as this, because in the early 2000s, the Turkish government decided to build a motorway through there, so they had to blow it up. So it's a bit wider than it was in medieval times, but it's still a very strategically important pass. Now then, types of evidence. This is where we begin to look at the difficulties that historians face in bringing together all our different types of material, because we have our historical narratives, that we have historians who tell the tale, as it were, of their own in earlier times, and they tell us about things like taxation, social relations, long-term economic changes, and so forth. We have archival documents which tell us about agriculture, population, production, and so forth. We have archaeological materials that provide us with coins, which tell us about, to some extent, about the economy, as well as settlement patterns, and a whole range of other things, including domestic issues, household structure, food consumption, and so forth. Then we have the archaeological sites, which we can do site distribution analyses of, looking at demographics and so forth, And finally, we have, I didn't put it at the bottom because it's the least important, it just happens to be there, the paleo-environmental data. And integrating these different types of data set is one of our big challenges. And that's what our project is partly setting out to try to resolve, to create a methodology which we can transmit to other projects to find more streamlined ways of bringing this material together. Now then, one of the things that I need to point out is that there is the so-called Roman warm period coincides with the height of the Roman Empire. There are all sorts of arguments about the exact relationship between the flourishing success of the Roman Empire at its height and the conditions in which it existed. But it is very clear that from the late 2nd century CE onwards, we begin a period of relatively unstable climatic conditions. No major dramatic cataclysmic events as such, but a gradual decline in the beneficence of the climatic conditions for production, and we can see that reflected in the archaeology and the evidence we have for the way in which the empire was able to collect and manage resources. And it's often been assumed that, and there is some parallel here, that the collapse of the Roman Empire on the one hand and the arrival of the barbarians and the breakdown of traditional classical civilization on the other are associated, or should be associated causally, with these climatic changes. And there's no doubt that they played a role, but they clearly aren't a single effect, because we have a number of examples, and the Byzantine case is a good example, where in spite of climatic conditions and changes that did impact on agricultural production and the economy, a societal system survives relatively unscathed in many respects. And I merely put that up to demonstrate that we have, if you look along the top line, the Roman warm period, the late antique Little Ice Age, it's recently been dubbed, lasting up until the 9th century, and then the medieval climate anomaly, followed by the Little Ice Age, which you're probably much more familiar. If we try and put historical developments parallel to those changes, we can make the parallels, we can find things that run alongside the changes in climate and patterns of weather at a local level. But as I said before, tying these parallels into each other in a causal way is much more difficult. One can hypothesize that if certain sorts of climatic features are evident and they're paralleled by certain societal changes, then there might be a causal relationship. The question is to do more than simply state that, but to try and work out what are the mechanics of that causal relationship. And this chart was made by colleagues of mine who published a paper in German Quaternary Science Reviews, I think, recently, and they unfortunately used the expression demise of the Eastern Roman Empire. And I shall show you today that there is no demise of the Eastern Roman Empire, at least not in the sense that they are suggesting there. I said we'd concentrate on Anatolia. Anatolia is a region, it has a very complex seasonal pattern. It's part of 3 global systems, as you can see there. It means that therefore we're dealing not with a generalizable environmental situation, but with a series of micro-environmental situations, and we need to take those into account, both when understanding the climate changes that take place and their impact on society on the one hand, very importantly though, also in understanding the ways in which they are reflected in the pollen, the palynological data that we have, and the patterns of agriculture and agricultural production that we can derive from that information, as well as historical data. If we want to look at the actual climatic changes across Asia Minor in our period, there are a number of key sites which climate scientists have exploited. There are other sites which are currently being examined now. We are lacking, when you compare the pattern of sites that have been examined in Anatolia, modern Turkey, with that for either North America or Western and Central Europe, we still lack a lot of information. Excuse me. But we've got enough to support some general hypotheses about the impact of those broader patterns that I showed earlier at the local level. And one of the things that we seem to be seeing from these analyses is that whereas in the Levant there is a relative cooling and drying in the period from the middle of the 6th into the 8th century, much of Asia Minor experienced a slight warming and a definite higher degree of humidity. And so thinking about that in terms of our historical sources, which describe different sorts of conditions in different parts of the Middle East, we need also to think how those differential impacts affected what people saw on the ground in terms of how they reported, say, weather events or whatever. This is I merely showed this just to show that this is from 2 lakes in Central Asia Minor, Lake Nar and Lake Teja, from which we have a lot of very good evidence, which takes us right back into prehistory. We can tie that evidence in with historical and archaeological data. And again, as you can see there, the pink band in the middle is really the period that I'm concerned with, and you can see that there's a distinct trend towards a more humid climatic situation. I'll come back to that shortly. That's Nar, one of the 2 lakes in question. Nar is important for other reasons, though. This slide actually doesn't help us much because it's meant to show the different types of information we derive from our textual sources. But I'm not going to talk about those in any detail for now. When we come to look at the most important part of the survival of the empire, resources and the access it had to resources, but one of the key questions is what were the sources of grain? Grain both for the state and for, in particular, for the army. And what's interesting about this is that Egypt had been the breadbasket of the empire until its loss to the Arabs in the 7th century. Many of the other sources of grain, North Africa, were also lost. Sicily remained a potential source of grain. The Balkans produced minimal amounts of grain because it was occupied by hostile peoples. Asia Minor produced a reasonable amount of grain, and particularly the northern coastline seems to have come into its own in this period. And again, I want to come back to that shortly, because the grain supply of the empire is one of the most crucial aspects of its ability to survive and weather the storm. These are the sites, there are a few more now that we've been exploiting, but these are the major sites from which we have pollens from. And as you know, pollen, different types of pollen can tell us a great deal about what's being produced at any given moment, about the relationship between agrarian production and the scale of production on the one hand, and about the types of crops that were produced and consumed. And one of the interesting things about the pollens from the sites that we've explored or been able to work with is that there appears to be, beginning in the 6th, but speeding up from the middle of the 7th century, a very important transformation in the general pattern of agrarian production from the standard Mediterranean triad of cereals, olives, and vines on the one hand, and fruit, to an agrarian regime that focuses much more on grain and livestock. And one of the things that we notice from pollens from the Levant is that as the climate becomes a little bit more arid, cereal production declines, whereas in Asia Minor, with these slightly more humid conditions, it's clearly increasing. And although I haven't got a nice graph to show you, I've just listed some of the sites here where we can give estimated ends of the so-called Byzantine occupation phase, which is a period of agrarian, anthropogenic agrarian activity which dominates the Eastern Mediterranean up until the 7th century. And it used to be assumed the reason the shift in agrarian patterns changed was to do with climate. But you can see from that, firstly, that the date doesn't match any single moment of change. More importantly, secondly, some types of agriculture which are traditional carry on, but others stop. And so you have a very much more varied pattern across Asia Minor, where herding, small-scale agriculture, livestock and grain production in particular become much more prominent. But the traditional patterns don't disappear entirely. So we can't really relate these changes to climate, or at least not to climate alone. And when I was thinking about this, I was also thinking about some of the anthropogenic events that might have impacted. And one small example, which I haven't got a slide for, relates to the evidence we have from Nar, the lake in Cappadocia, southwestern or south-central Anatolia. We have very beautifully preserved vast sediments of pollens going right back to the 2nd century CE, datable by C14 very precisely to half years up to the last century. And it's possible to show very exactly that human activity in terms of the production of the local crops virtually ceased between the year 674 and the early 680s, to be replaced by scrubland, weeds, and various other flora. And this coincides exactly, even to the half year, with pretty reliable reports from both Syriac and Arabic and Greek sources about the occupation of this area on a yearly basis by Arab raiding parties, which obviously did enormous damage to the local agrarian infrastructure. Doesn't mean to say that there were no people there, because archaeologically we can still find traces of settlements, but they were producing negligible amounts of pollens in terms of crops and output, so we can assume that there was a demographic collapse. And the settlement pattern also changes archaeologically to very, very highly dispersed and almost negligible. I won't go into any more detail, but this is a case, it's one of the few cases where we can tie in the paleoenvironmental data very precisely to our archival and textual and archaeological sources. There's obviously more evidence that one can cite to support the case. But the point is that we can show that in this particular instance, hostile activity, the activities of raiding soldiers, had a dramatic, if not catastrophic, effect on a particular area. Now, that isn't true of the whole of Asia Minor. Some areas were affected badly, others less affected. Many areas were virtually unaffected. But what we notice when we're looking at the pattern of change is that the areas which were least affected seem to be the areas where we have good pollen evidence for this increase in the production of grain and livestock. And when we look at the textual sources for the way in which the state raised taxes, we find some interesting changes insofar as the vocabulary of tax collection shifts. Firstly, towards the assumption that taxes are collected in kind rather than in cash, as had previously been the case. I'm simplifying it to give the big picture. Secondly, grain became much more important, but at the local level to supply local garrisons and soldiers, as well as the state's fiscal infrastructure, its civil service, if you like. And thirdly, that the fiscalization of these taxes in kind, in other words, converting them back into cash, only occurred in areas where military or military activity was demonstrably minimal. The other point is that what this shows is that we have a rough idea of the size of Byzantine field armies, which were settled across Asia Minor. We find that the smallest army is settled in the largest area up here, the 12,000, give or take 2,000 or 3,000. Is settled in that area because that's an area which produces least in terms of agrarian material. And the largest army, or the larger armies in the west, are settled in the wealthiest provinces. So clearly the armies were garrisoned in areas according to the ability of the areas to support them. And those areas are all areas in which we have this increasingly mixed and varied pattern of agrarian production, more grain, more cattle. And that's what armies need. They need leather for their equipment, they need grain for their bread, they need animals for transportation, for food, and so forth. So there seems to be a correlation both between the change in fiscal terminology and language on the one hand, and the increased output in terms of, relative increased output in terms of grains and livestock on the other. And at the same time, there seems to be a close relation between size of armed forces garrisoned in provinces and the ability of those provinces to feed them. If you put all that together in the context of more rain, which is relatively good for cereal outputs, then it seems that two things were going on. And we don't know which comes first, and we don't know whether this is a conscious decision or not. Firstly, we do know farmers respond pretty rapidly to seasonal changes, and it's possible to convert from one type of output to another relatively quickly, particularly if you're going away from, say, viticulture and oleoculture towards grain and livestock, providing the terrain, of course, and the soils are suitable. It's harder to go the other way, as you know. But converting some of these traditional labour-owned outputs towards grains and cereals and livestock isn't too difficult. And we have examples of it from Italy in the 5th century, where we can demonstrate how quickly it can happen. So farmers seem to be responding to shifts in demand, perhaps, as well as possibly shifts in climate regime. More importantly, with the change in government fiscal language, it looks as though the government is cashing in on the potential of the landscape to produce more of the things it needs. And these two things possibly reinforced each other. One can imagine a situation which we know we have in Italy in the 5th century from legislation, whereby the government starts increasing the amount of tax to be collected in a particular product, thus stimulating production in that particular product. So one of the results of the investigation is that it seems highly likely that we have here a flexible social response to quite significant environmental changes in the broader sense of environmental, political environment, natural environment, and fiscal environment. And that the government of Constantinople is responding effectively to those changes, cashing in both on the ways in which farmers farm their land, as well as in the increased ability of the landscape to produce the products required. And just to hammer the point home, this might look like a graphic version of your IRS tax return, but in fact it's a sort of flow chart of the East Roman government in the 7th to 9th centuries. Obviously it's artificial in the sense that I've extracted from our archival and textual sources a model for how the administration functioned. But all these departments of state existed. We have the lead seals of many of the officials who manage these departments. It probably wasn't anything like as efficient as a modern democracy for all sorts of obvious reasons. Nevertheless, this is a sophisticated bureaucratic state, and it was extremely efficient at extracting the maximum amount of resource from the landscape and from the producing population. And we know, as I said, going back to my 5th century example, we have very concrete evidence that the government Rome was able to influence agricultural production. This particular example is from southern Italy, to its advantage when it needed more grain production. And we have archaeological evidence for increased building of granaries. We have textual evidence and legal sources for increased pressure on producing populations to produce more grain and so forth. So we can imagine that exactly the same sort of situation prevailed in the Eastern Mediterranean. This just to show you a couple of examples, since we haven't had any pretty pictures yet. these are standard Byzantine numismata or solidi gold coins weighing 21.5 carats. This is the standard precious metal coinage of the Eastern Roman Empire right through to the 12th century. But it was accompanied by a bronze coinage, a petty currency for day-to-day usage. Ignore the charts, which are to do with a particular argument about the way in which currency was produced in the 60s and 70s. But this is an example of a find from northern Turkey, a hoarded pile of bronze of different denominations. So we have a fairly sophisticated market economic structure on the one hand, with the state fiscal apparatus imposed upon it, designed to extract the maximum amount of resource it could. So, when I come back to my 5 factors, this is my list. Geographical compactness obviously played a role. There are other issues we haven't talked about, but number 5, I think, fits into the broader environmental picture and helps us to understand a little bit about how both ordinary society on the one hand, the producing population in the countryside, and bureaucratic state regime on the other, responded in a relatively difficult crisis-like situation to the sorts of pressures it faced. Now, I skimmed over a lot of material to make the case in a short period. But it is a fairly compelling case when you stack up all the different sorts of evidence, both from the environmental and environmental side on the one hand, and from the textual, archival, and archaeological side on the other. And so, in the 10th century, the Arabs were still puzzling about how they could finally get rid of the Eastern Roman Empire. Thank you very much.
We have questions.
You had mentioned that the converting taxes to in-kind payments rather than cash was a crucial piece of evidence. Could you just restate that argument really quick? I wasn't sure. Do I need to say that again? Could you restate the line of evidence about the fact that taxation was converted to in-kind payments and the importance of that?
Yeah, because we have a fairly highly monetized economic system, the government always has a choice. When it needs resources, it can decide not to collect them in money, but collect them in actual products. When one looks at the general pattern of Roman and East Roman history from the 3rd or 4th centuries on, right into the high Middle Ages, you can see very clearly that this shift, it can be regional in one part of an empire but not another, or it can be empire-wide, responds fairly precisely to various sorts of financial or economic pressure. What we see, importantly though, in the later 7th century, is not just the state collecting more resources in kind, but a shift in the way that resources are assessed and a shift in the vocabulary to describe how they're assessed and where they're put and how they're moved around, which suggests that quite a significant change is going on in terms of the government recognition of the situation we have to deal with. Yeah.
Could we get back to the Goldilocks? I missed the point of what's too much and what's not enough. Is it the rainfall?
The too much would have been one of the things I didn't mention was that we also have a general pattern across the Middle East of cooling, to which Anatolia appears to be a small exception. Had Anatolia suffered the same degree of cooling as the rest of the Levant, then probably the ability to generate an increased production in terms of grain and livestock might have been affected. I mean, it's a hypothesis.
So it's about cooling rather than about rainfall.
It's about cooling and rainfall, because with the increased rainfall, we get an increased ability to generate more cereal crops more easily.
So you partly answered the question, but So now you can contrast this part of the Roman Empire that actually survived the Arab invasion with this very large part that does not. And so all this list of arguments that we have criticized for, I mean, can you point by point explain how those are different than the rest of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so the first thing is to decide what we mean by decline or collapse. And so I think the easiest way to put it is this. The core of the Eastern Roman Empire survives. It's fairly clear that in terms of society, the structure of the social relation between elites and ordinary people, between government and the rest, stays very much the same, very little changes. Outside of, to the west and to the north, there are substantial changes. The empire loses control of the Balkans. It's no longer able to maintain an infrastructure and to control communications and to maintain an urban infrastructure. In Italy and in the West, though, while the empire itself as a political form disappears, the states that replace it are actually quite stable, differently articulated political systems. And the amount of, let's call it catastrophic change or transformation that takes place is really far less than you would think when we talk about barbarian invasions. Yes, there's some violence and warfare, but as far as one can tell from the Western sources, which are actually very full in many respects, particularly from Francia, from the old provinces in what's now France and Western Germany, we have a lot of documentary material from the 6th century on, both in terms of chronicles and histories on the one hand, but also in terms of monastic archives and so forth, that show that really, in terms of agrarian output, relations between landlords and tenants, even land ownership at the top, between the political centres and the elites, and so forth, very little really changes. So there's a shift in political forms, but very little in terms of economic structures. And so one could argue, as I would, that the transformations that occur in Central and Western Europe are transformations rather than cataclysmic or catastrophic changes, which is rather different from the barbarian conquest and so forth.
What confuses me then is why there are strong environmental differences between the two. You don't see that in this essentially consequence.
You do. I mean, in the Western and Northern European world, there is a distinct cooling from the 4th century on. And it is thought that that has had an impact on outputs, agrarian production, and the ability of the state to collect resources. So that probably contributes towards the breakdown of Western Roman political infrastructures. But I suppose, to some extent, where it's a question of semantics, what do we mean by dramatic social change and flexibility? So the flexibility of the Western Roman Empire seems to be far less than that of the East. For example, the flexibility of the society that inhabits the space controlled by the Western Roman Empire seems to be much greater. So one of the things that I'm always keen to point out is to make two differences. One, there's a difference between the economy of society as a whole and the fiscal economy of the state. And two, there's a difference between the society that the state maintains in terms of court-elite relationships on the one hand, and the society of ordinary societies who are a wider society on the other. And often one's affected where the other isn't.
Can you say anything about the state of science in this period? How was it growing or declining?
Well, in general, what we see, and it's one of the reasons why the phrase Dark Ages has been used, what we see are two things. One, a very dramatic collapse in secular learning and literacy, and two, a dramatic increase in theological literature and literacy. So there isn't an absolute decline in literacy as such, but there's a massive shift in emphasis and interest, which represents contemporary ideological priorities or concerns.
Was that driven from above, or was it?
I think it's generated from within society itself. It simply reflects the conditions under which people live. access to education, for example. There is something else which I haven't mentioned, and that is there is a fairly major shift in patterns of urbanization and the nature of urban life, and that affects education. So that really from the 7th into the 10th centuries, if you want an education at all, it tends to be either in Constantinople or a major city, and there aren't very many major cities, or it's in a monastic or ecclesiastical environment. So as for secular science, the classical collection of disciplines, arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and so forth, as well as the literary sciences such as rhetoric, continue. They're still available and accessible, but they're placed under a much, let's call it a more rigid Christian management, so that one has to use them and deploy them within a Christian ideological context. Because if that doesn't happen, then the accusations of paganism or heresy tend to
So there was a recent study in the areas around the Mongol Empire for the Little Ice Age, and during that period it appears that rainfall was enhanced and moved the area, the fertile area sort of moved southward. And that sort of reminds me of the story you were telling about this particular interval. What you suggested climatologically is that there was this general cooling, this one region was spared this cooling and became wetter. What it more feels like is that the entire region was undergoing a cooling event. It's hard to have a kind of real regionality in temperature change. And then what was happening is the westerlies and the rain associated with mid-latitude storms are moving further southwards.
The work done on the North China Mongolian region by my colleague Miguel at the Institute where I study in Princeton is there's a sister project which is looking precisely at whether there's an association between that and the rise of the Chinggis Empire, the rise of the Mongol Empire. And there do appear to be associations, particularly in terms of the availability and accessibility of the right fodder for herds of livestock, on which no man's asking paid. So there was more hands which I ignored.
So you said that more water will bring an increase in production, but I'm kind of surprised because most of the time when you have more water, you increase the risk of disease, and especially for plant production. So I'm just, is it just something very particular to Anatoly, that the fact that a little bit more water because I used to drought or dry weather, or do you see a kind of excess at some point which affects the population in the other way?
We don't know because we don't have enough data to say. There are two things that we could say. One is that throughout this period there is a general demographic downturn, so that the population across Asia Minor and the Balkans is going down, that's for sure. And it's supported archaeologically as well as by some of the pollen data. The increase that I'm talking about in livestock and grain production is therefore relative to the total population rather than absolute increase above previous levels. But we don't have the data to say whether, for example, increased humidity causes an increase in crop disease. What we do have are occasional mentions in our textual sources for outbreaks of cattle murrain or crop disease of one sort or another. But it's very general. We don't know whether that's specific to that environmental moment or whether it's something which people... the observers at the time have no notion of fitting into a bigger context, of course, so they don't specify whether it's unusual or whether it's regular or whatever. It would be interesting and important to know. And it might be possible, eventually, according to my climatological colleagues, to detect shifts in the pollens that might indicate something of that sort.
Perhaps a question about the way how you try to explain history. seems to me, the curiosity that I have is there seems to be more and more coming to these events point to the climate, which I believe, as I understand it, it comes back to this pure deterministic ideas which are credited for a long time. So my question would be, where is the field these days? Is it generally a relaxed attitude, or does the global warming story play a role in that suddenly this has become sort of acceptable again?
Yeah. Well, first of all, of course, one of the things that it's historians are generally extremely suspicious of these sort of, deterministic potential for monocausal explanation. So they're very reluctant to use proxy climate data in any explanation. And a number of very important books that have come out in the last 10 years where climate is completely ignored, even though it could be very significant. The trick is to find a way of integrating the climatic data, as I've tried to show at least, in a more sophisticated way that isn't deterministic. Where are we in general? I suspect, yes, contemporary discussions and discussions over the last 20 or 30 years about global warming and so forth have had an impact, because people can observe, to some extent, contemporary shifts and changes and ask questions from that angle. Historians began to think about the impact of climate on history back in the 1890s, 1920s. And mostly they only had textual and documentary evidence to work with. So it's only really since the 1960s we've had more scientific data. And it's really only since, I guess, the 1990s we've had much more precisely datable pollen evidence and more detailed accounts of major changes in the past in terms of surface sea temperatures, for example, using the Greenland ice cores and so forth to have a look at the big picture, and then zoom down to local and regional differences. So yeah, I think those discussions probably have had an impact.
Could I make a suggestion? Taking on from what Karim Zakaria the other day was talking about, the problem in the region that today you are focusing on. 30 years ago, we wouldn't think that it would have been problematic as it is today. Now, going back to the transition stage, is the emergence of new religious communities, let's say, in this region, in any way related to the kind of the global or the political influence and power of the Roman Empire, with the shifting of Constantine, old Constantine came from Constantinople to Rome? Would it be a wise guess, or what would be your submission of other than contemporary view, looking at this same phase from the other Roman Empire?
It wouldn't be incorrect, I think, to make connections. The difficulty of making connections sufficiently complex, as it were. There has recently been a couple of articles by climate scientists working with historians on the possible connections between the expansion of early Islam and what's going on in the Arabian Peninsula in terms of climate. And one hypothesis has been, and it seems to be backed up by pollen as well as other data, mostly climate data, is that in fact the Arabian Peninsula gets wetter and more productive in the second half of the 6th century and into the early 7th century, and it produces a greater number of, it increases the potential for herding as well as for agrarian production, and that may connect in with the rise of the sort of connection between early Islam and the expansion of Islam. But it's a complicated, it's also a politically nuanced question, because obviously people won't necessarily want to hear that their religion is a result of climate. But it's something that I think needs to be explored, and I think will be explored, but it needs to be done fairly diplomatically and carefully. But it's definitely an issue. Yeah.